choosing new software is important. If it goes well and it becomes part of our daily workflow, we might be using a given piece of software for years, maybe even decades. So it's important when we make these decisions, we don't want to get sucked into a vendor, like a walled garden, right? So anytime you make a choice about adding a new piece of software, I think it's important to keep that in mind. How hard would it be for me to leave if I ever had to change apps? Welcome to the Sovereign Computing Show, presented by ATL BitLab. I'm Jordan Bravo, and this is a podcast where we teach you how to take back control of your devices. Sovereign computing means you own your technology, not the other way around.
This episode is sponsored by ATL BitLab. ATL BitLab is Atlanta's Freedom Tech hackerspace. We have co-working desks, conference rooms, event space, maker tools, and tons of coffee. There is a very active community here in the lab. Every Wednesday night is Bitcoin night here in Atlanta. We also have meetups for cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, decentralized identity, product design, and more. We offer day passes and nomad passes for people who need to use the lab only occasionally, as well as memberships for people who plan to use the lab more regularly, such as myself. One of the best things about having a BitLab membership isn't the amenities, it's the people. Surrounding yourself with a community helps you learn faster and helps you build better. Your creativity becomes amplified when you work in this space. That's what I think, at least. If you're interested in becoming a member or supporting the space, please visit us at atlbitlab.com. That's atlbitlab.com. All right, on to our show.
Welcome to the Sovereign Computing Show. I'm Jordan Bravo. I'm recording today from the heart of Atlanta at ATL BitLab with Stephen DeLorme. What's up? Today we're going to talk about how to choose sovereign software. What do we look for? What are the signs that software is better than others? So we're going to get into that, but first we have a few news items and products and applications to look at. First, the article is called "Say Goodbye to Your Custom ROMs as One UI Kills Bootloader Unlock." And what this is about is Samsung has announced that it will no longer allow people to unlock the bootloader on Samsung smartphones to be able to load their own custom operating systems on it. So what this means is that if you want to use any other like de-Googled Android, whether that's Graphene OS, Lineage OS, Calyx OS, you cannot use that with Samsung devices. The article mentions that this is actually not going to change anything for United States users because Samsung took away the option there to unlock the bootloader years ago, but it was kept open for users in other parts of the world. But that is going to change starting soon with their next major version. If you had hopes that you could use a Samsung phone to load a de-Googled OS on their version of Android, then unfortunately Samsung is not going to be an option in the future for anybody, and it's not an option in the US currently. So this is unfortunately a step backwards in my opinion. Right now we have Google Pixel is the only phone that Graphene OS can be loaded onto because it's the only phone that can unlock the bootloader, put on a custom ROM, and then relock the bootloader, which gives you the most amount of security, protects you from evil-made attacks, physical in-person attacks on your phone, on your device. However, if you are less concerned about that and you're willing to have that risk of an unlocked bootloader, there are other brands out there. Now Samsung is no longer an option, but there's Motorola, I believe. I don't know, I'm blanking on other brands. Do you have any off the top of your?
I don't.
So this is unfortunate. This is one less option for people to use on Android for de-Googled OSs, but ultimately it's not the end of the world. There's still plenty of other options out there, but just wanted to bring this to your attention and something to keep in mind.
So you mentioned that there's like kind of that security risk with having the bootloader open and being able to load your own custom firmware on there. Is that just kind of a risk that's always going to be there with stuff like Graphene OS?
No, in fact, Graphene OS in particular is one of the reasons they only support being loaded onto the Google Pixel is because the Google Pixel is the only Android phone where you can unlock the bootloader, put on a custom OS, and then re-lock the bootloader.
Okay.
So Graphene OS doesn't suffer from that vulnerability. But if I have, let's say, a Motorola phone, and it's of a kind where I can unlock the bootloader, and then I load like Lineage OS, let's say, on there, or Calyx OS. Now I've got a de-Googled phone, de-Googled OS on my Motorola phone, but I don't have the ability to re-lock the bootloader. So if I left my phone in the room and you wanted to install malware on it or compromise it, and you had physical access to it, you could do that. You could mess with the operating system somehow.
Do you think, I'm just curious with like devices like these, do you think, what would be their argument for, making a change like this? Is it like, well, we want to make our users more secure, so we don't want to have the option to even foot gun yourself with an open bootloader? Or is it something more like, well, we don't make as much money on, data collection or something if this is, accessible to be replaced with an open source operating system? Any ideas?
You'll probably never hear that second one that you mentioned, but that might be part of the motivation. However, I often hear the first one. They don't say anything in this article about why Samsung is doing this. They haven't like released a press statement. But what I typically hear is, as you mentioned, it's all in the name of safety. We want our users to be secure. We want to protect against malware, et cetera, et cetera. So by restricting freedom on the phone, freedom to load your own operating system, yes, in theory, they are making you more secure, but they're also removing your ability to do what you want with your own device.
Yeah. Got it.
Any other thoughts on this article?
I think I'm good.
Yeah, pretty straightforward. Not the end of the world. The next one we're going to look at is, the headline reads, Privacy Advocates Sound Digital Sovereignty Alarm. And this is all about the age verification requirement in the European Union, the EU. You might have heard this, but a lot of EU legislation is being passed now. I think it started with the UK, but also is going live in the EU, where they are forcing users to have to dox themselves, to basically KYC themselves, to provide ID and age and identification verification in order to be able to use some basic apps. So like, imagine you want to download an app from the Google Play Store. You have to first upload your driver's license or your government ID to your Google Play account, and then they have to approve you and make sure you're not on a bad person list, and then you're allowed to download. And then of course they keep track of everything that you download. So this is pretty dystopian and absolutely in the opposite direction of digital self-sovereignty. And I don't know what the EU's like goal is for this, but it just seems really, they've been doing a lot of stuff lately in this direction of just making it kind of like a surveillance dystopia in the EU. The weird thing about this is I didn't pull up the article here, but there's another article about how the EU is publishing papers on how they want to be more digitally sovereign. Yes, that's right. They want to be more digitally sovereign, but they also institute all this surveillance crap. So it's kind of like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, or maybe the reasoning is that they want to be more sovereign from other countries, like they're sick of relying on American tech companies, but they themselves have no problem with being big brother when it comes to their own citizens.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. It's a geopolitical concern. It's that they want to be able to have greater control over where their silicon comes from and how the chips are made probably, and what software they're using, what their supply chain risk, geopolitical supply chain risk is. But yeah, it doesn't have anything to do with making the citizens more digitally sovereign.
I will say though, I'm kind of torn because when I see stuff like this, they also talk about moving in the same way that they want to move off of like big tech platforms from the US, like Microsoft, Google, et cetera. they are putting a lot of money into open source software. So you'll see governments and big corporations adopting open source alternatives. We're talking Nextcloud instead of Google Docs. We're talking, or Microsoft, we're talking Matrix instead of Slack, Microsoft Teams, that kind of thing. So in the one sense, it's really cool to see these open source projects getting a lot more a bigger user base, which means more funding, which means better features, more people using it, more security, more people developing for it. But on the other hand, if I lived in the EU, I would really be pissed off. I would feel like the walls are closing in when it comes to digital sovereignty and freedom.
It's interesting though, it does say they're trying to provide privacy preserving digital proof of age for accessing restricted online services. It's built on the European Digital Identity Wallet Blueprint. The system uses anonymous credentials and data minimization principles. However, security requirements mandate Google Play distribution exclusively. So I haven't dug into the specifics of how this is built or how this technology works. If it does indeed verify privacy, it's not out of the question that it could actually use some sophisticated, arrangement or cryptography principles to be able to verify age without keeping a record of the identity. It's not impossible. To me, it seems like this issue is this might be less about privacy and more about Google, right? Because when you look at stuff like the DID spec and decentralized identity, a lot of people have been working on decentralized identity projects for decades now. And, it's not the kind of topic that really gets talked a lot about in mainstream circles. People like to talk more about in the Bitcoin side of things, Nostr, and outside of that, people talk about Blue Sky and stuff like that. But decentralized identity, a lot of people have been working on it and for credentials for a long time. And you can do the kind of stuff with that where you can have a credential issuer that issues you a credential. You do go through a standard KYC process, but then they issue you a digital credential. And with that digital credential, it makes it so that you can then verify that you meet certain criteria without having to actually verify your age or actually verify your identity. So another take on this is that it might actually be a good thing. Again, I haven't really dug into the specifics of that, but if it's built on some of those decentralized identity fundamentals and verifiable credentials, this actually could be the kind of thing where you can verify age without needing to know their identity. And that could be, really powerful for making it so that kids can't get to porn sites and stuff like that. But I think that the key thing that might be critical here is Google's grip tightens on EU digital identity. Just the concern I'm seeing in this article on a brief perusal is just the idea that it only works in the Google Play Store the way it's currently defined. And so by only working in the Google Play Store, it could completely cuts out all of these open source app stores.
Yeah, it would be really cool if they are using decentralized ID technology and verifiable credentials. That would be cool. But the problem is it is a Google centralized platform. So it's not like Google is, at least we don't know from the article here, Google doesn't seem to be opening it up to multiple providers. And as long as you're following the spec, can verify yourself. But that doesn't seem like at all what's happening here. It seems like they're more locking down. You have to use Google Play. You have to use the Google Play Integrity API. And quoting from the article here, it says, this means apps from F-Droid, Aurora Store, or side-loaded installations face elimination. And so we've talked about this before in previous episodes about alternative app stores. And this sounds like it's going to make it even more difficult or even impossible to be able to use those.
Bummer.
Yes. If you are in the EU and you happen to be listening to this, let us know what you think. Are you concerned about this?
Bootstand and let us know what we got wrong about it too.
Oh yeah, I think when I jumped into the show today, I forgot to mention that you can email us. Our email address is sovereign@atlbitlab.com. And don't forget, you can also send us a message with a boostagram in a podcasting 2.0 app, such as Fountain.fm or Podverse or any of the others. All right, let's move on to the next article. I want to look at a couple of apps now. And for two-factor authentication, a lot of people are familiar with Google Authenticator. What people might not know is that Google Authenticator is an implementation of an open source spec of the time-based one-time password specification. That's where you open up an app and you see a 30-second countdown timer, and every 30 seconds it shows a new 6-digit code, and you copy and paste that code into your whatever you're logging into, and that's how you get two-factor authentication. So all of that whole scheme, the way that works, is a completely open specification. And Google Authenticator just being the most well-known by most people. But there are other options, and one of them we're talking about today is a new offering by Proton. We talk about Proton a lot because they are catering to privacy. They're a privacy-respecting company, and they offer a lot of open source software. And today we're talking about Proton Authenticator. This is a alternative to Google Authenticator. Some of the benefits that Proton Authenticator provides over Google Authenticator would be that they're from a company that respects your privacy, and their whole business model is to preserve your privacy rather than Google, whose business model is to mine your data. It is also open source. It has zero knowledge syncing so that you can sync it across devices but it's completely end-to-end encrypted. And then if you go to one of these classic marketing charts where they show this product against other competitors, they show that Proton Authenticator is open source, encrypted sync, no ads or tracking, cross-platform, so it's for Android, iOS, Windows, Mac, and Linux. That's cool that they have desktop clients as well. And they have direct export, meaning if you ever want to pull your data out of it and use another app, you can do that very easily. Stephen, have you had a chance to try out Proton Authenticator?
I have not, though I'm excited to try it. This whole chart full of green check marks makes me excited. I currently use Auth. I had to compare the logo here against the one on my phone, and they're actually... Oh, I see what they're saying. I thought that was saying they don't support Android OS. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I've always used Auth, and that's worked pretty good because it at least has that encrypted sync check mark. The Google one hasn't. I think they stopped supporting the desktop application, which got really annoying because I used to love having the desktop application because then I could just get the 2FA codes without pulling my phone out of my pocket. So it'd be cool if Proton is going to have the same one here. That'll be nice. I think one potential security concern that I've been thinking about with 2FA codes, though, is that I've definitely seen a movement to try and make 2FA codes easier to use. And for example, 1Password actually supports 2FA. You can actually put the 2FA codes inside of 1Password, where you store the username and the email and the password and all that kind of stuff for our website. And that can be a little problematic because you think about that the whole the 2FA code is supposed to be unique. It's supposed to be a second authentication factor aside from the password, so that if your password gets compromised, you still have this other layer, this other factor that keeps your data and your account separate. And so in the event of 1Password, I think it's kind of interesting that they support it because it's well, if somebody did get my password, it might mean they have access to my 1Password. And if they have access to my 1Password, then they also have access to the 2FA. It doesn't mean they have access to your 1Password. They could have gotten your password through other means, but just saying that if they did get access to your 1Password, they would have all of that. And I imagine that it's the same with Proton Authenticator. The way a lot of their services work is that it's I think it's with Proton Drive and Calendar and Mail. It's all kind of encrypted against the key that's derived from your password. So if you're using, Proton has a password manager. So if you're using their password manager, or you're using Proton Mail and you're using Proton 2FA, you just run into this scenario where if you're using the password manager and the 2FA, And if that password gets leaked, they kind of have access to all of it. So, it's one of those things you got to be careful with. It might be worth like kind of breaking it up and like using authenticators from different services, or I don't know. I'm not sure, but it does seem like a slight potential risk. But having said that, I'm glad that there's another 2FA thing on the market. And, I think Proton's a good actor in the space and all of that. So happy to see that they have a product.
Yeah, so what you're saying, I know exactly what you're talking about with the separation or the supposed separation that you're recommended to have there. I use Bitwarden right now for my two-factor authentication. And like you were saying with 1Password, I've got my passwords and my 2FA codes in the same application. And so if somebody were to get into my Bitwarden password manager, they would have both my passwords and they would have my 2FA codes, like you were saying. I personally I consider it worth the risk. I don't know, maybe I'm being naive, but I feel like if my Bitwarden is compromised, that's a problem right there, right? I have a bigger problem in my hands. So by having 2FA in Bitwarden, it's a simple like one click or one key press when I'm logging into something. So it'll ask for my username and password. That's one key press, and then 2FA, another key press, and boom, I'm in. Could it be more secure if I put it on a separate device? Probably, but I feel like it's a acceptable balance.
Yeah, it might be. I mean, it just depends on the threat model, I guess, because that's the thing. It's like, I guess when I think about how your password gets leaked, it's probably more likely to get leaked by like something that intercepts your password from a form input, like some kind of malicious script on a website or a keylogger or something to that effect. Probably, or, if some website service doesn't, is using a weak encryption algorithm or like a weaker hashing algorithm for storing their passwords. They're not salting their database properly, all that stuff. Your password gets reverse engineered through like a database dump with rainbow tables. Then if that's the threat model, then yeah, totally. They're not in your password manager. So yeah, I can see the appeal.
Another example would be your email gets compromised and somebody goes and resets your password on a website, but if they don't have your 2FA code, they can't log in.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to point out here is that if you want to use Proton Authenticator, one, it's completely free. You don't have to sign up for other Proton services. And two, again, you don't have to sign up for other Proton services, meaning it's separate. So if you are not using any of the other Proton products, you can still use Proton Authenticator as a standalone app. You don't even have to create a Proton account.
Wow.
Any other thoughts on this? Because I want to talk about one other Authenticator app.
Yep, I'm good.
Okay, the other Authenticator app is called Ente, E-N-T-E. And Ente actually has their main product is a sort of a Google Photos alternative, but their Auth, Ente Auth, is another just good Authenticator app. It is open source. It's end-to-end encrypted for syncing, and it is completely free to use. And it is also self-hostable. So if you want to, just by default, you can use their servers for syncing your end-to-end encrypted backups, but you can also self-host it. I have not a chance to do that. This is actually pretty new on my radar, but I think at some point I might give it a shot.
Sweet.
Yeah.
That's probably more than I'm going to be lazy and use stuff like Proton Authenticator.
One thing about Auth, I did used to use Auth, but I found that you have to use a phone number with them, and I don't like that. So I'm bullish on Proton Authenticator, Ente, Bitwarden, these kinds of options.
Yeah, I want to get off Auth, honestly. I've been using it for too long. It's time to make a fresh start with a new Authenticator app.
I like how on the Ente Auth page, it gives you the different download options. and it's got the usual platforms, but it also lists F-Droid.
Nice.
So they're clearly respecting people's choice of app store.
It's a nice looking marketing website.
Yeah. Real quick, even though this is kind of off topic, click on the Ente homepage and you'll see their main product, which is, again, a Google Photos alternative.
Did we cover this on another episode?
We have not. We briefly talked about Image, but it might be good to do a deep dive on Ente.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
I like the sound of it.
All right, well, that's all of the apps and articles we wanted to look at today. We're going to talk about our main topic, which is how to choose self-sovereign software and what do we look for when choosing software. I'll go through some of the things that I look for, and then Stephen, maybe you can share your opinions. I would say I look for the following. I would prefer an app to be open source. It's not an absolute requirement, but it gives me a lot more trust and comfortability with the project. Another plus is if it is self-hostable. Again, I may not self-host it right out of the gate. Some people may never self-host it. That's fine. But the fact that you can, I feel like it's a very ethical business model. They're saying, we don't have any magic secrets that we're hiding. We have the source code is open. You can even host your own server if you want. But most people are happily willing to pay for the convenience of having a company host their own infrastructure for them. So to me, that's a very ethical business model. It's compatible with privacy and digital self-sovereignty. Another thing I look for is if an app is cross-platform. Obviously, I'm partial to more open platforms, and we know that Apple is pretty locked down. But even if they do have an Apple offering, I want to see them having an Android offering. It's great if they have offerings outside of the Google Play Store. So if they are offering it, let's say on F-Droid or any of the other alternative app stores, that's even better. Or if you can just download the APK, that's also great. Another thing that I look for is I don't want any vendor lock-in. And so I look for how easy do they make it to exit or to export your data. So if you are unhappy with the service, or maybe they just go out of business or go offline and you need to take your data and go to some other company, how easy is that? Do they make it directly exportable in a common format that you can easily import somewhere else? And on that similar note, do they use open standards or open formats? Is their data locked behind some proprietary format that nobody else uses and maybe is completely opaque? Or is it something that everybody uses? Is it a JSON file, let's say, or is it maybe a Markdown or YAML or something like that? Something that you can easily save it and it's plain text. You could read it with your eyeball if you want, and then you can easily import it into some other app that it uses an open standard as well. Anything that you wanted to, well, let me get your thoughts as well and just kind of go through your thought process, Stephen, when you're looking for new software, when you're trying it out and maybe considering, do I want to make this as part of my workflow? Because choosing new software is important, right? We're going to be, if it goes well and it becomes part of our daily workflow, we might be using a given piece of software for years, maybe even decades. So it's important when we make these decisions, we don't want to get sucked into a vendor, like a walled garden, right? This is a classic Apple technique. And Apple makes a lot of great stuff, but they also are notorious for locking you into their ecosystem. So you're using their phone and their laptop and their software, and now you might look elsewhere and say, you know what, I would love to use software X for something, but I can't because I would have to change my entire ecosystem over, right? So that's a lot of momentum that's holding you into their ecosystem. And that's so anytime you make a choice about adding a new piece of software, I think it's important to keep that in mind. How hard would it be for me to leave if I ever had to change apps?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you stated. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with any of those points. On the open source side of things, I think it's important to investigate and dig a little bit deeper. No using open source as a buzzword. Like, it's a thing that you can fall for easily when companies just throw around the word open source on their marketing website, or sometimes they don't use open source as a term. They'll just put a link to GitHub to like make it seem like, oh, we're cool developers. We have a GitHub and we share our code. And then you click into their GitHub and it's just like, I don't know, an example repo or something like that. I mean, I've seen like tech startups that will put like a link to their GitHub just because I guess they think it gives them like cool points, but it'll just be like a README file with, you know, some markdown links to their API docs or something. And it's like, okay, that's not open source. It's, you just have a GitHub profile. And then even when a product advertises themselves as being open source and it actually is, like, you then have to question like, well, is it maintained? And one thing I look for is just going to the GitHub page and just seeing in the commit history, has anything happened recently? And if you see something that's like updated a year ago, that might be a red flag. If it says updated 4 years ago, that's a serious red flag. If it says updated a year ago, that might be more like an orange flag. It kind of depends on the software in question. Like, is it the kind of thing that doesn't need frequent updates? Even a year, though, is still a long time, and you would think that there would be some security updates or something. But if it's a simple enough application that doesn't really deal with sensitive data, I could totally see it going by for a year with no updates. But you just got to kind of keep that in mind, that if there's no update history, it might not be maintained. And, you know, then it's like, even furthermore, it's like, I like to think about like, well, who maintains it? Is this a startup that's moving fast and it's going to be subject to change because they're just iterating quickly? Or is it, you know, the kind of project that actually has like a community behind it? Because when there's a community behind it, even if there's a startup that backs it, when there's like an open community for, you know, even if it's just like a Discord or something, if there's kind of a place where they invite people to, you know, share feedback, and, you know, if they welcome contributions from people outside of their company, then that signals that, okay, well, this is like a robust open source project where they're thinking about long-term maintainability and stuff like that. So that makes me feel a little bit safer adopting it if I can see more frequent commits and if I have a better idea of who is maintaining it and all of that. And I think a company can actually be a great thing. I mean, there's a lot of examples of open source projects that have been either maintained by companies or nonprofit foundations dedicated to serving the project. And that can actually be really good, because then, you know, you actually have people who are on the payroll of the project, so to speak. They can commit a lot more serious quality time towards maintaining the project versus a project that might just be some developer's kind of hobby project or something like that that they might forget about in 6 months. So that's kind of what I think about when I think about open source, at least.
No, that's a great point. Open source is not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet that will solve every problem. And like you mentioned, there is a wide spectrum of open source projects in terms of quality, right? You have something on the one end is like this unmaintained hackathon project that somebody threw up 4 years ago after a weekend session. And then on the other end of the spectrum might be something like Proton Authenticator, right? By a company that's, I don't know, I haven't seen their repo, but I'm just saying, hypothetically, it's well-maintained, well-funded, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. It uses professional coding guidelines and this high quality. So keeping all that in mind, you mentioned you want to see some recent commits that gives you more confidence in the project. Maybe we could show people how to check that. Like, let's say they find a link to an open source project and it takes them to GitHub. maybe they don't know anything about GitHub. They've never used it before. How do they check the commits?
Well, let's see. So why don't we just pull up this Ente one as an example? So I'm assuming this is one is open source. Let's find out. Hey, open source, mobile, web, desktop, CLI. So I can see here in the footer, for those that are only listening, I've gone down to the footer of this Ente Authenticator app we talked about earlier. In the footer, I found something that says open source, a column, and there's links for mobile, web, desktop, CLI. So I can click on all those. So I'll click on the mobile one and see.
And just so people know, sometimes you'll just see a GitHub logo, which is the little octocat.
Yeah.
And that's usually takes you to their GitHub repo, which is their source code.
And it looks like this is like a mono repo that has stuff for mobile and and desktop and all the other, flavors of their app inside of it. So I'm actually going to click on, I'm in like a subdirectory full of all the files. I'm actually going to back out and just click on the main project name, which is Ente. And then I can see here under the phrase Ente, just at the very top of GitHub, it has like make CI fail on warnings. And it says committed 16 hours ago. And it has a little, picture of the person who committed it or all that. Another thing I can look at is I can go onto the side and I can look for releases. And it'll usually tell you, so commits are like the developers pushing updates, but they don't always make that like an official release, right? Like the developers are usually always pushing new code to a frequently maintained project, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're cutting a new release, which is when they're like, okay, we are done working on this new version of the software. We are giving it a release. We're giving it a number. In this case, it's Auth v4.4.3. Sometimes they give it kooky names. It was released 2 weeks ago. That's a good sign to me too, because it means that they've recently done new releases. And I can go back in time, and so this one might be a newer project, maybe.
Well, you're looking at the specific release.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, if I go to releases, if I go back a page, I can see all of them, and it says, okay, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, July 3rd, June 2nd. So it seems like they have one release every month, which is, okay, that's a good sign. It's like, look, I'm not going to go through and, pick through every single bullet point of the change log for all the release, but I can scroll through this page and quickly get the idea that this is a well-maintained project. It has a very consistent cadence for cutting new releases of the software. So this to me, just kind of eyeballing it on live on the pod, it looks to me like it's a well-maintained open source project.
Another thing that I like to look at is going to the issues.
Yeah, so if we scroll to the top of this page and we go under the repository name, we can click on issues. And there's 386 open issues right now. And just because there's 386 issues doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, in my opinion. What I tend to find is that the more a piece of software gets used, the more issues it has. And I think the reason for that is because twofold, as it grows in size, like as they add more features, every feature adds a little bit more complexity. And then when you have more users and more people using it, you increase the likelihood that someone will use it in a way that you didn't expect and uncover a bug that you didn't know was there, or request a feature that you didn't know that they wanted, that sort of thing. So, and then when it's a public repo, you also, or I should say when it's open source with a public repo, it's a little bit different. Like people can just open issues. It's not like a closed help desk where you can't see what people are asking at the help desk. It's like a public help desk, and you can see everybody asking for stuff at the help desk. And so some of these are going to be good requests. Some of these are going to be bad requests. Some of these are going to be serious, absolutely critical, we need to fix immediately requests. And some of these are like, it can wait till later. That would be a nice to have. So anyways, that was a little bit of a rant, but context for people that aren't used to looking at GitHub issues.
And I would just add that it's less about the number of issues and more of, are people reporting issues and are they being responded to and either worked on or closed for other reasons. So in this particular repo, we could see that there are 386 open issues, but there are 796 closed issues. So it sounds like a lot of issues are being closed. Now, again, we don't know if those were good or bad issues, if they were trivial or important or critical issues, but the fact that somebody is actively maintaining this repo is evident by the fact that issues are being addressed.
Yeah, and like for example, in this issue I pulled up, it's like, sounds like this, someone's having an issue with faces not being synced between desktop and mobile, and looks like somebody who works on the project says, sounds like it might be an issue with the mobile app not being able to decode those pictures properly. Can you reach out to support with the logs and we'll take a look? And so it looks like this kind of got turned into more of like a customer support thing rather than an actual code change in the project. And that's the sort of thing is when you run into stuff like this that are like big, well-maintained public projects, like sometimes the issues kind of ends up doubling as like a customer support pipeline and all of that. But you can get a feel for the pace of the project, and that's good as somebody responded to it. So it seems well-maintained.
Yeah. I notice this is not the Ente Authenticator. This is the Ente Photos app.
Yeah, that's right. I was on correct. Good call. We had navigated to the photo app when we were finishing up that topic, so I already had the tab open for it.
However, everything we just mentioned about looking at the repo and judging the software and the project, this all applies. It doesn't matter if this is the Authenticator app or the photo app.
Yeah. And I'm not going to like shame some poor open source project here on the podcast. So I'm not going to go hunting around on GitHub trying to find a bad example. But you can imagine that, the GitHub issues might have issues not being responded to. And, it might say committed 4 years ago, and there might be an inconsistent release schedule. And hey, some of my open source projects are like that too, inconsistent release schedule. So it happens to the best of us. It doesn't mean that the people who made it are bad people or anything like that. It just means that it just might, signify to you the difference between a well-maintained, super robust project versus something that's maybe a little bit new or maybe more of a hobby project.
Right. These metrics are all health indicators of the project. No single one is necessarily a death knell or make or break. But another indicator that we could look at is the number of contributors. Mm-hmm. So if you scroll down on the right side of any GitHub project or even GitLab or other repo, you'll see the contributors, and they'll have a number, which is the number of contributors, and then a bunch of little avatars of each person's account who's contributed. So this has 215 contributors. That is a very healthy number of contributors. So that's another a plus for this project.
Yeah. I think on some of the other stuff you mentioned too, self-hostable is always great. I don't really have, too much to comment on there. Cross-platform, no vendor lock-in, open standard format. Yeah, I agree with all that. And some I guess it depends on the software you're using. Some types of applications might not even have open standards or formats, but it's good when they do. Like an example of that to consider would be like, let's say you're talking about word processing. Well, there's ODT, the open document type, or I think ODS, is like open spreadsheet or something like that.
ODF for format.
Yeah. And, that was an alternative to Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, all of those types of Microsoft Office files. And I'm sure that was pioneered with OpenOffice. I might be wrong on that, but there's also LibreOffice, and there's other like word processing and
shout out to OnlyOffice.
OnlyOffice.
Yeah.
Never heard of them. But yeah, so they must support that same format, I'm assuming, or you would have brought them up. So these sorts of, that's an example, like, okay, that format works across, all of them. I think another way to think about it too is like, what the purpose you're using, is this application going to be a one-time thing, or is it going to be something that's kind of like deeply embedded in your life forever? So like if you're choosing like an email client or a password manager or a chat application. Like these are all the kinds of things that are going to become deeply embedded in your life, and you're probably going to use them every single day. Then, like for me, operating in the kind of design and art world, I can safely pick up an open source art application and use it only for one project. So I love the Blender project, one of my favorite open source projects, a cool 3D application. And there's just certain, professional projects you may not be able to use it for because you may need deeper interoperability with Cinema 4D, depending on who you're collaborating on a video or a game or an animation with. There's a ton of open source formats it does support, but depending on the team you're working with or the kinds of tools you need to integrate with, it might not be your daily driver, but I can safely pick it up for one project that's only me working on it, right? And so there are some kinds of self-sovereign open source tools that you might use just for one-off projects because you can safely use those sorts of things. And if the project is no longer supported in a year or isn't interoperable with your friend's software, that's fine. So I think that's just depends on your use case. Is this a daily driver? Is this a one-off project? All that kind of stuff.
I did have one other category that I look at when it comes to choosing software, and this is kind of a no-brainer that I almost forgot to mention it, but that is how good is the UI and the UX, right? That's the user interface and user experience. Now, if I am choosing, in some categories of applications, your choice is going to be limited. If you are prioritizing things like open source, self-hostable, cross-platform, all these other things, you might only have one or two choices, right? But all other things being equal, if one has a pleasant UI that's delightful to use and it's super easy to figure out and discoverable, and the other one is old looking and ugly, then obviously I'm going to go with the one that has the better UI, the UX. So that one might seem a little obvious. There's not a whole lot to dwell on there, but I just wanted to bring it up. It is something that goes through my head as I'm choosing software.
Yeah, totally. I mean, on the note of Blender, it was for the longest time, they had this interface that felt very 90s. And I think it really harmed the adoption of the software, even though they had their reasons for it. But, before left clicking on the mouse was the norm. In the 90s, there was just before Windows and Mac just completely, I guess I should say before Windows completely stole mindshare, society hadn't quite settled on this idea that right click opens a menu and left click does a primary action. And it was because you would buy an Apple computer, and in those days, Apple computers just had a single button on the mouse. And there was the PCs, there was Windows with the double mouse. And then sometimes you go the Sun Unix computers from the late 80s and early 90s would have 3 buttons. I'm not talking a scroll wheel. I'm talking about it would be a mouse with 3 discrete buttons off face. And so there was just a lot more variety in terms of even mouse input. And Blender was kind of made in that period in the 90s, and they had just some kind of quirky mouse behavior and the way their UI worked, and it's really confused the crap out of everyone for a long time. And they finally updated the UI, and it looks more modern now, and you can use the mouse thing. And that was a huge hindrance, even though it was solid 3D rendering engine. It just the UI messed with everybody. And then another example is Penpot. Figma. I love Figma as a piece of software. The experience is great as design software. I know they're tracking my every move, and I just try to not think about it. And I've tried to adopt Penpot, which is the self-hostable, open source, pay-to-host alternative to it so many times. And every time I try to use it, I just I'm frustrated within 15 minutes or within 30 seconds. The performance is just such garbage. And it just pains me to say that because it seems like a team of nice people working on it, working very hard. And they've actually shipped some incredibly cool features design tokens and an open API. They really put a lot of thought into the types of features they support. but because the rendering engine is so slow when you're using it, the performance just feels so janky. And so it's like, well, it's not a daily driver, so I can't adopt it as a designer because of the user experience, no matter how great the ethos of the team is or how much I like their feature set. The UX it doesn't work as a daily driver for me. So, but I'm hoping that they're going to overhaul the render engine one of these days, and I'll be able to come back on another episode and report that I've, dropped Figma. But, one day I can dream.
Yeah, that'll be cool. While you were talking about that, it reminded me of another aspect that we haven't really covered yet, which is, well, we talked about health metrics of a project, right? You go into the GitHub, recent commits, that kind of thing. But what about monetization and a business model? We've seen in the past instances of projects that come out and they're open source and they're awesome and everybody loves it. But then the maintainers, they don't get paid and they get burned out or they get pulled onto something else or move on with their lives and the project dies on the vine. So something else that's good to see, I think, is does this product or project have a sustainable business model, or does it have a healthy monetization source? And that can be another factor in determining what software might stick around for the long run.
Yeah, that's a great point, because they all have different ones. Again, if you have one that's just like a solo dev maintaining it in their free time, you don't know if that project is going to make it or not. And, maybe you don't want to, maybe if it's going to be a pain to move off of it, it might not be your daily driver. Yeah, that's obviously bad. Then you have stuff that's like Signal. We've talked about Signal a lot on the show. I think there's a Signal Foundation.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure they are funded entirely by donors. Like there's no business model for Signal. So that's pretty interesting. And I don't know what their team size is right now, but I think when I first started using Signal like 7 or 8 years ago, it was like 6 people working on it or something at the company full time. It was lean. That's what it looked like, at least. Maybe they've grown in size by now, but point is that they seem to be able to persist off of this like open source foundation donor model. It is kind of a source of concern of like, well, what if whoever stops donating to them, like who's gonna ultimately foot the bill for Signal? You got to pay the devs for security updates and maintenance. They have to run some infrastructure to make that magic happen. So maybe that's a concern. But, I'm not trying to like spread FUD about Signal. I love it and use it every single day. But you have to think about these things. Sometimes you see with projects, though, they'll have an open source foundation and they'll get a lot of corporate donors, and that would be good. Like the Linux Foundation, I don't know who funds that, but it must be like corporate donors, right?
Yeah, a lot of companies are on the board of the Linux Foundation, like Microsoft, Red Hat, Google, etc.
Probably OpenSUSE, maybe.
Yeah.
Or
Canonical.
Yeah, so you have companies that always makes sense. If you have a foundation that has like a lot of corporate backing, you at least know the foundation has deep pockets at that point. I think another great model is just when you have a project that has a company that's incentivized to run it. I think the pay to host is a very valid business model. And when you just have a pay to host, at least you know that it's a company and the company has an incentive to keep supporting it. So that also works too. But that's the kind of thing, is that when there's no money involved, that's where there's a little bit of that's almost like maybe a red flag for me. It's not a red flag that there's a malicious intent. It's just a red flag for me of like, is it mature enough to be a daily driver?
Well, I certainly don't want to cut you off, but why don't we tease this for a future episode where we go into detail about open source business models, ethical business models, and that whole topic, and we can really do a deep dive on it.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
All right, well, were there any other criteria that you wanted to cover or anything else regarding our topic today of how to choose software?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Catch you later.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to learn more about anything that we discussed, you can look for links in the show notes. That should be in your podcast player, or you can go to atlbitlab.com/podcast. On a final note, if you found this information useful and you want to help support us, you can always send us a tip in Bitcoin. Your support really helps it so that we can keep bringing you content like this. All right, catch you later.